Okay, so in the last video we set up the actual art for the door frame and the door itself, but Unreal still doesn't know what we wanted to do next. So we know, Unreal doesn't. So let's talk to Unreal with Blueprint and tell it what we wanted to do. So we've got a door mesh and a door frame. What we need next is something that the player can sort of walk into, allow Unreal to detect the player so that then we can send information to some kind of function or something that makes the door open. So we need a way to check if the player is anywhere near the door. Okay? So in real life, what you would use is some kind of probably like an infrared proximity sensor above the door or something like that. In Unreal we don't have one of those, but we do have something called trigger volumes. And what a trigger volume is basically it's usually a box cube, and whenever a player steps inside this cube, a signal is sent, almost like an alarm, to the system. And when that signal is sent, we can use it to do stuff. So think of it almost like pulling a string that is attached to, I don't know, a lever on a door, and when you pull the string it pulls a lever up and the door becomes unlocked. That's kind of like what we're doing here, except we're doing it in a really fancy way with Blueprint. So let's see how we can do that. Let's come over here to add a component. We're going to add a new component to our door. This time we're going to go down and we're going to go to shapes, and we're going to pick a shape. So we have different shapes. We have spheres, capsules, and boxes, and you can really use whichever one you want. You can use a sphere if you wanted to. I'm not going to. I'm going to use a box because a box is going to work a little bit better with this door. So I'm going to select the box, and we're going to rename the box, and we're going to call this trigger volume. You call it anything you want, proximity sensor, whatever. I'm calling it trigger volume. It's usually helpful to keep names very simple and logical. That way if you walk away from this and come back to this same project 2 months later, you're not looking at this stuff trying to refresh your mind going, what in the world is a turtle proximity gopher smasher sensor? What is that? If you use a common logical name, it'll be much easier to jump in here and understand what it was you were doing that night. So anyway, so I've renamed this to trigger volume. Now you'll notice inside of our viewport here we have this yellow box. And the cool thing is we can change the size of this yellow box. This yellow box is going to be basically the area defined by our proximity sensor. So if the player steps into any area that is inside of this box, the door will get the signal to open or do something. Probably open or blow up and sabotage the player. That'd be pretty cool too. So what we're going to do here is we got to resize this box because right now it's way too small. The player would literally have to crawl on the ground and stick his face right at the bottom of the door right here in order to get the door to open, which well, it could be pretty funny if you're making a game where you're trolling players and stuff like that. But we're not doing that right now. We're going to be nice, and we're going to create a big a huge box so the player can walk into and get the door to open. So a couple of ways we can do this. We can take the scale over here and we can increase it, so we can say 100, 100, 100, something like that. I'm not going to do that though. I'm going to do this in a much simpler way. I'm going to take the box, use the scale tool, and I'm just going to scale it up like this, which is a little bit easier. I'm going to move it, and let me see, it's a little bit big, so I'm going to go ahead and make it a little bit smaller, and maybe I'll take the Y scale, the green handle, and I'll scale it out like this. It's a little bit big, but it's okay, it's good, because when we walk into the area here we don't have to be all careful about, oh, are we inside the small box or not. We'll have it take up a generous amount of real estate, so it makes it easier for the player, and they don't get frustrated and call you up in the middle of the night demanding your money back. Alright, cool. So basically our trigger volume is already set up. It's already there. So I'll save this. And another thing about Blueprint is, let's actually jump in here inside the map. If I look at my door here, I don't see that yellow volume, the trigger volume anymore. It's not here, but when I go here, it's actually here. So what's happening? Well, we have to do something called compile. If you've ever worked with code before, then you're familiar with what the word compile is. I'm assuming everyone watching this video hasn't worked with code before, so this is probably one of the first times you hear the word compile. May even be the very first time. I don't know. Compile basically means that we take all of the changes we made to this blueprint so far while we were working on it. You know, when I added this trigger volume, scaled it up, moved it around, stuff like that. We need to compile most of the time so that the changes are compiled and hard-coded, so to speak, so that the game knows and the game can play. It's kind of like saving, but not. But just don't worry about it. So if you go up here to the top, you're going to see this compile button. It's got a question mark. Okay, that means that this blueprint has been changed and needs to be compiled, and it has not been compiled yet. So you probably should do that. So the compile is actually a very, very difficult and tedious process. What you do is you click this button, you get a green check mark, and your blueprint is now compiled. Okay, so I lied. It's not a very tedious or difficult process. So if I jump back inside of my viewport here in the game, you can see now our yellow trigger volume is inside of our level. It's part of the blueprint. It's there. If I move this around, you'll see it's all part of the blueprint. The blueprint is one whole item that encapsulates all these different components: the door frame, the door, the trigger volume, any stuff we have attached to this as components. So always remember to compile. Now, I like to work fast, so I always use a ton of hotkeys whenever I work in the hundreds of programs that I work in every day for a living. So there's a shortcut to compile, and the shortcut by default is F7 on the keyboard. So you're going to notice that I'm compiling blueprints real quick, and I'm not hitting that button up there. It's because I'm using the hotkey. It's faster, easier, simpler, saves a ton of time. So I'm going to be doing that from now on, just in case you're wondering. Okay, so now we've got our trigger volume. All right, let's go back to the map. I'm going to jump in. We don't see the trigger volume. One thing that's important to note is that trigger volumes are not visible when you play the actual game. They're meant to be invisible. The player doesn't see them. The player doesn't, run into them. It's not an invisible wall. If I walk over here, you'll see that I'm inside the trigger volume, but I can't tell. Basically, if I never showed you that I made that, you would never even know that it's here. But it's what's going to trigger this door to open. And that's actually how a lot of games are made, which is pretty cool. Okay, so now we got our trigger volume, but it isn't doing anything. Well, now it's time to go into the graph. So we'll go into the graph. Now it's time to get our hands dirty and start building stuff here inside of the event graph. All right? So the way we do that is pretty simple. We can do it a few different ways. We can drag and drop nodes into the event graph, or we can right click and we'll get this contextual menu. Contextual menu basically means the menu is going to show you a bunch of different options based on what you're doing right now. So right now I'm not doing anything, so I'm going to get all these different options. So I can, for example, I can go to variables, I can add variable, I can go to call function and get a bunch of functions I can call up. I can add events, all kinds of stuff. I can also go to my favorites over here, and I can click and drag, say, an event begin play, and drop it right here. See that? Pretty cool. And I can click on this node, and I can drag it around with the left mouse button, which is pretty cool. I can select a whole bunch of nodes by just left clicking and dragging a selection box. And when I have nodes selected, I can delete them by hitting the delete key on the keyboard. Alright? So what I want to do now is I want to see if that trigger's working. I know the trigger's here when I look at it in the components view, but I don't know. I'm kind of a paranoid person. I would love actual proof that this trigger exists in the game and that it's working. Because when I play the game and I run around, I don't see the trigger and I don't see anything happening. So being a very paranoid person, I'm thinking to myself, what if the trigger's not really there and my eyes are tricking me right now? Well, this is commonly called debugging. When you debug, it means that you're testing stuff out because you're not sure if it's working. So it's a great way of making sure that your code works. Right now I don't have any code, but this is what we're going to do. We're going to debug and test that trigger volume, and we're going to do it like this. We're going to grab this event begin play and drop it in here, and I'm going to delete it because I like to waste people's time. I'm going to right click and I'm going to go over here to add event, and here's event begin play. See that? It's the same exact node that's over here. It's just two different ways of accessing it. And you can actually go to library and you can find it here too. If you go to add event, here's event begin play. If I drop that in here, it won't actually drop a new one. You can only have one of these at a time in a given graph, which may not make sense to you at first, but once you start working with Blueprint, it'll make perfect sense. That's because there can only be one begin play. And begin play gets activated when we do this. It just got activated. It just got deactivated. It just got activated. See what I'm doing? Every time the game starts, the event begin play gets fired off. It gets called. It happens. Okay? It's kind of like being born into the world in real life. You can only be born once. Once you're born, you can't be born next week again or 3 hours from now again. You can't start over or whatever. So you got to think of event begin play like that. There's only one event that begins play. That's just the way it works. That's why we can't copy this or make a copy here. That's why we can't drag and drop another one. If we try to do that, Unreal will simply zoom in on this guy, and that's it. So we're not going to get into that stuff right now. That's just the way it works. You gotta, like I said, you have to keep an open mind about this because there's going to be stuff in here that makes you go, well, I don't think it should work that way. But that's the way it works. There's a good reason for it. The people who invented this are very, very smart, much smarter than me and much smarter than you. So they know what they're doing. Just accept the rules of the game and play. Okay. So let's debug this before I end this video, and then we can continue on with the next step. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in this event begin play, and this is going to give off a signal when we start playing the game. And on event begin play, we'll do something. So this is what we'll do. I'll right click and I'll go to print, and when I search for print, I'm going to get this print string. I'm going to click on that, and if I go ahead and plug this in here, watch what's going to happen. First thing I got to do, and before I do that, I'm actually going to mess this up on purpose. I'm going to jump into the game, and well, there it goes. It actually worked without even compiling. Or actually, there it goes. It compiled. I didn't even notice when I compiled. Anyway, it's compiled. What happens is I get this string of characters. So I'm just going to write a bunch of random stuff here and then put a bunch of kind of dash marks here just so we could see this clearly. I'm going to compile that. Still wondering how I compiled before. Could have sworn I did not hit the shortcut key. Anyway, I'm going to play. See the text up there in the top left? When we start the game, a signal gets sent out to this print string, and this print string function will write this text on the screen, which is that blue text in the top left of the screen. So let me delete that. I'm also going to go ahead and delete this guy here. We don't need that. What we need is some way for us to know when the player touches this trigger right here, this trigger volume. So the way that we're going to do that is by using something else. So I'm going to select this trigger volume over here to highlight it. Now this is the cool thing about Blueprint that I really, really love. When I'm working on Blueprint and I'm working on something new that I've never done before, I don't have a recipe book that tells me how to do this stuff. So I have to figure it out on my own. And the way I do that is with a bunch of logic and reasoning and just trying to be as smart as I can be with my brain. But also, Blueprint helps you out. The way it helps you out is like this. If you select this guy over here, right? And then you right click over here. If you go here, you're going to notice that Unreal is giving you some suggestions based on what you have selected. So if I don't have anything selected, okay, and I right click, I don't get any suggestions. I just get all of the list of items down here. But if I click on trigger volume and then I right click, now I get these two suggestions. So Unreal's going, Guy, you've got trigger volume selected. Well, here's some recommendations from the chef as to what goes good with a trigger volume. How about our spicy hot sauce? That goes really good with our trigger volume. How about a drink? That's the way it works. So Unreal is giving you these suggestions. So here it's saying, well, you might want to use an event for this trigger volume, or you might want to use a function for this trigger volume, specifically for it. So I know I want to use an event for the trigger volume, and the event is when the player touches the trigger, something happens. That's an event. So we're going to go to event, we're going to go to collision, and we get these three options. We get one called on component begin overlap, and on component end overlap, and on component hit. So when you're new to this, you're not going to know which one to pick. You're going to need somebody to kind of show you and pick one for you, which in that case is me. So we're going to pick the begin overlap. So why did we pick the begin overlap? Let me show you why. Let me right click again, go back to this menu. We have three options, right? So what you want to do when you're using Blueprint is you want to use logic, common sense in your brain. The cool thing about programmers is most programmers are some of the most logical, common sense people you're ever going to meet. The way they think about problems, both on the computer and in real life, is super, super logical. Okay, that's just the way that programmers tend to think. So, yeah, that's how it works. So over here we have on component. That's our trigger volume. That's another word for trigger volume. It's a component, right? We have end overlap. Okay, so let's think about what that means. End overlap. What in the world does that mean? Well, we're looking for something that is something along the lines of on enter or on trigger touched or something like that, right? Well, end overlap. Think about that. When you end something, well, you're ending it. That's pretty self-explanatory. An overlap, well, an overlap is basically when something is touching something, isn't it? I mean, yeah, that's kind of what it means. You're overlapping, you're on top of something, you're in something, you're overlapping it, right? Well, here we have an end overlap, and here we have a begin overlap. So this one probably means when we start to overlap the trigger volume, we do something. When we end that overlap of the trigger volume, in other words, when we walk out of the trigger volume, this is what happens. Okay? And on component hit probably means when we hit it. Okay? So when we touch it one time, and that's it. So the reason why I chose begin overlap is because that one's going to allow us to do a trigger where when the player walks into it, they activate something, which is what we want. So now we have this event, and events are red, by the way. You'll notice that the title up here is red. That's an event. So we have this on component begin overlap trigger volume. And now what this does is it can trigger something every time the trigger volume, this trigger volume, is touched by a player, or not touched, but a player walks into it and starts to overlap it. or begins to overlap it, we're going to send out some kind of a piece of data, information. Think of it as like a really annoying kid standing in a corner and he's watching this spot. And when you stand in this spot or walk into it or put one leg in there, he's going to yell and be like, hey, he just walked in this spot. He's walking in this spot. And this kid's really annoying. So that's basically the way it works. Trigger volume is going to start to yell out, oh, that you're in the spot. And I could actually prove it to you. Let's do that. I'm going to drag this pin out, and I'm going to let it go here in empty space. When I do that, I'm going to get a contextual menu. The cool thing is that this menu right now is showing me only nodes that can be connected to this. So let's say, for example, and I'm just saying this off the top of my head, I don't know if this is the case or not, but let's say Blueprint has, I don't know, 500 nodes. I don't know if it does. Let's just say for the sake of argument, let's say there's 500 nodes in Blueprint. It's going to take you a long time to dig through all of them and try to figure out what works with this trigger volume. But Blueprint filters them all out. So if out of those 500, only 25 work with this trigger volume, Blueprint is going to intelligently filter all of those other ones out and give you only the 25 that you should be concerned with, or only the 25 that are compatible with this trigger volume. And that makes your job easier and lets you work faster. So I'm going to go look for that print string again, this guy, which gives us a message. So in case you're following me here, what I'm going to do here, maybe you can guess. What I want is when I touch that trigger volume to say something. So what am I going to tell it to say? I'm going to retype this. I'm going to say, you are in the zone. I'm going to make it very clear that we're inside the zone. And I spelled zone wrong. Okay, cool. So basically what this does is when we start walking into the trigger, when we're in it, the trigger is going to send out this and say you are in the zone. So I'm going to compile this. F7 is the shortcut again. Jump back in here. I'm going to play. I haven't touched the trigger yet. I can't see it, but I know that it's a little bit closer to the door than where I am right now. I'm going to walk over here, and boom, there it is. See the message? You are in the zone. Every time I walk out and then walk back in, every time I begin to overlap, it'll say, you are in the zone, which is pretty cool. So now I know that I'm not paranoid. This thing actually works. Cool. So now that I know that that trigger volume works, I can actually do stuff. I can connect a bunch of stuff and tell something to happen when we touch the trigger. So this video is run pretty long. I'm going to end it here, and in the next video we're going to go ahead and we're going to continue building this out.